opinions and statements expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of WWDB, its staff, or management.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Boomer Generation Radio. This is your host, Richard Address, coming to you again from the studios of WWDB AM 860 here in beautiful Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Streaming live on www.dbam.com. And a reminder that if you want to get in touch with the show, give us any ideas or suggestions, etc., you can email us at boomergenerationradio@gmail.com. That's boomergenerationradio@gmail.com. This portion of Boomer Generation Radio is brought to you by Kendal, a system of not-for-profit communities and services located in 8 states in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and near Midwest regions of the United States. And a reminder that Kendal advocates for and empowers older adults to reach their full potential and is committed to working with others to together transform the experience of aging. And to learn more about Kendal, that's Kendal, visit kendal.org or call toll-free at 888-759-0128. And it is a pleasure to welcome to the Boomer Generation microphones here at WWDB AM 860 in Philadelphia, Dr. Jeanne Mary Walker, a professor at the University of Delaware, Blue Hen. They used to kill us when I was at Temple, and it's been a long time ago. But it's another story for another time. Welcome to Boomer Generation.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
We're beginning with this conversation of a difficult series of conversations. It's going to lead into next Tuesday's show, on which we're going to spend an entire hour discussing various aspects of issues related to dementia and Alzheimer's. And the reason why is because it's so prevalent in so many families, and the statistics that we keep seeing from the organizations like the Alzheimer's Association they keep telling us that in the next generation, the next 20, 30 years, the possibilities are a doubling or tripling of the number of dementia and Alzheimer's cases that we're going to be dealing with as baby boomers live longer. And there's all kinds of issues associated with that, and we are going to do a whole hour on this next week. But Jeanne, if I can call you Jeanne, has brought with us a gift, a book called The Geography of Memory, subtitled A Pilgrimage Through Alzheimer's. So let's begin with the obvious. What's this book about?
The book is really telling the story of how my sister and I took care of Mother through the last decade of her life when she was verging into Alzheimer's. It's set back in the early 200s, which means we didn't know what she had.
200, you mean 2000?
2000, sorry.
The last decade.
So we had no idea.
It was the 200s, you got a real story.
So it's a narrative. Mm-hmm. It tells the story, and I think it's not just another narrative about caretaking. As I found out after Mother died, I didn't really have time to read the other narratives before that, but there are a lot of narratives about caretaking with Alzheimer's that are pretty gloomy. They're, the view of the patient that you see is primarily kind of a shell, an empty shell at the end of her life. And so what I've tried to do here is tell the story of my mother's whole life. So the end years are put in the context of her earlier years, and that seemed like a natural thing to do because towards the end of her life, she really did get to be somebody who would speak as if she were 14 or speak as if she were 30. And I would recognize that 30-year-old because it would be somebody I knew from when I was a child. And so it's almost as if there were a lot of different mothers living inside of her, and that made me recall much of her history so I could write it in this book. And her later years then become a lot more meaningful because they're told in the light of her earlier story.
So your mom you guys dealt with this for over a decade.
We did.
So that's another thing that one of the challenges of this disease, it can last years and years and years. And the family system, mom lived in, Dallas?
Mom lived in Dallas.
Okay, and your sister lived in Dallas.
Right.
And you live here.
I do.
So you did the long-distance caregiving routine.
I was the one who did the long-distance caregiving routine. My sister did the at-home caregiving routine. So my shtick would be to get on a plane 6 times a year, usually on Thursday night, after I taught my classes at the University of Delaware, and stay until the end of Monday.
Mm-hmm.
So I would arrive after midnight, usually rent a car, drive an hour to where my mother lived in Dallas, get up the next day and start washing the clothes and taking her to her doctors and doing all that. Well, my sister was really on the front lines. If there was an emergency, she usually got the first call.
Well, she was there.
Yeah.
Right. So, was Mom in the end in a facility, or did she die at home?
No, she did not die at home. She was in assisted living for the last maybe 5 years of her life. She very belatedly went to an Alzheimer's unit.
Mm-hmm.
What we found was, as soon as she went to assisted living, she was much better. And the reason why was because she was getting her medications regularly. She was doing things, she was watched over and given a lot of meals, for example. Or she would there were paths where they could walk, that it was safe. She even still had a car while she was in the assisted living unit. But
don't mess with Texas.
Yeah, that's right.
No, don't mess with that at all. But did she use the car?
She did use the car. It was a little Saturn, and she drove around where she was. It was just the neighborhood.
Well, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. Talk to me a little bit about the dynamics of the caregiving concerns, the dynamics between you and your sister, and how you manage that.
Well, I think it's a very interesting and crucial part of the Alzheimer's story. There just were 2 of us siblings left. My older brother died when he was 18. But I was the oldest. My sister was the youngest, but my sister she won the cuteness prizes when we were little. And she was very impulsive. She grew up to be the head of the volunteer center in Dallas with a staff of 74. So she was generally in charge of people, and she was very controlling and knew what needed to be done. I was much more reflective. I read a lot. I talk I teach in universities and write books. And so we had this competition. There's no question about that. And we ended up putting that aside. I don't think we actually changed our roles in the family at all. We just understood at some level each of us had a different role. And that would be true because I was living here and Julie was living in Dallas too. And this often happens, I think, in families where siblings have really different roles.
Right, and my experience as a clergy person in situations like this, a lot of times the roles of siblings that they had when they were children replicate themselves when they grow up, especially in caregiving situations.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I was forever trying to get Julie to consult with me instead of just making the decisions about Mother. And eventually she reached the place, I think because she is just a very gracious human being. She said, "We will never do anything with Mother until the 2 of us agree."
Wow.
Now, we had been my husband was very, very fond of my mother. And so he called her every day. Mm-hmm. And then I was usually making dinner and he would pass the phone over to me. So we were in very close touch with Mother. But the other thing that happens, which is just astonishing, but natural once you come to think of it, is the parent treats you both differently.
What do you mean?
The parent will tell one child something that she won't tell the other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way we do with our children. We don't treat them all as if they're, Roman numerals or something like that. They're each people. And so Julie and I then had to compare notes When I went back to write this book, I had 1,000 emails from Julie saved. And we had many phone calls as well. So we kind of buried the hatchet. Not that we had ever really fought, but Mother became our joint project. And we built a community around that. And it was just wonderful. It's still, it's been, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years since she died, and we still see a lot of each other.
When you say you built a community around that, what does that mean?
I mean, we got our kids involved.
Okay.
They would go help us move her, or in one case, we have a son who played the violin. He would go play concerts at her community where she lived. Julie and Rich's kids got involved. So there were, all the generations were involved.
I think this is, people don't realize, unless you walk the walk as a caregiver, that it is really now a multi-generational experience. It's just not, there's always a designated caregiver or siblings who bound together, but this, regardless of the disease, but I think especially Alzheimer's and dementia really impacts on a variety of different levels all the generations of a particular family. I'm interested to know, if you can, because you write poetry, and so I'm going to make an assumption that your soul is tilted to this perspective. But how did this diagnosis impact you?
We never got a diagnosis.
You never got a diagnosis?
Never got a diagnosis. She was in an Alzheimer's unit without a diagnosis. But that was because of when it was. It was long enough ago, so they couldn't diagnose it without an autopsy.
Right. But this, obviously, you're watching your mom, to put it graphically, disappear before your eyes. That has to take a toll. There's somewhere, and you're sitting in that airplane flying back to Philadelphia after 4 days of this and experiencing this, especially in those last couple of years. Just if you can, and it's difficult, what was the impact on your soul and your psyche of watching this happen?
I think that the hardest thing for me was that I didn't feel mothered anymore. I was one of those lucky people who had a mother who was profoundly in my corner, and suddenly I was parenting her, and that was really difficult. What made it a little easier was that I knew my sister was parenting her too. I wasn't the only one. I wondered what it would be like for a single, somebody who was an only child. That would be hard.
Yeah, well, having done that, it's interesting. It's very interesting. I don't recommend it to anybody, not in any way, shape, or form.
Well, you take responsibility for everything then.
Yeah, but you're a poet, right?
I am.
Were you inspired to do any poetry? I know you wrote the book, but any poetry which has a little different slant than prose on this experience? Very little.
It doesn't appear in the poetry very much. Probably the effect of it appears in the poetry. But what did happen was, because I've been a poet really now for 40 years and think a lot about metaphor, think in terms of metaphor, I had the insight when my mother was talking that she wasn't just talking crazy, that often what she was talking about was something left over from her past.
Mm-hmm.
Once, for example, she began telling Daniel and me every day when we called her that there was a man knocking at her door, and she didn't know him. She didn't recognize him from the building, and she called him her gentleman caller.
Mm.
And we began to worry. I began to worry, and I thought a little bit about calling the desk and finding out how he got in. And then it occurred to me, no, this is like a metaphor. She's talking about courting when she was in high school. She used to tell me stories about this, and she sounded very similar. She would say, well, I don't know how to get rid of him without hurting his feelings. And she called one day and said to me, I'm just not going to marry again.
Mm.
And I said, well, good for you. That's great. She said, I don't want to take care of another man. It was something she was really wrestling with. But I understood it because I had been a poet in terms of metaphor, and it didn't make her seem so crazy. It was much less isolating.
Wow. We're speaking with Jeanne Walker, the author of this new book, The Geography of Memory, A Pilgrimage Through Alzheimer's. And I want to remind all of you that this portion of Boomer Generation Radio is being brought to you by Kendall Outreach, serving the field of aging by raising public awareness and advocacy around important issues of older adults. Through education, training, and implementation of comprehensive approaches to safe, individualized, long-term care practices, Kendall Outreach has been sharing Kendall's approach to quality care with consumers, advocates, providers, government agencies, and related organizations since 1989. And to learn more, visit Kendal.org, that's Kendal.org, and click on the Outreach icon. That's Kendal.org, Kendal.org. We're back with Jeanne Walker here on Boomer Generation Radio on WWDB AM 860 and streaming live on www.dbam.com. And a reminder that if you want to make a comment on any of the shows or offer suggestions, email us, please, at boomergenerationradio@gmail.com. Jeanne, the subtitle of this book is A Pilgrimage Through Alzheimer's. Talk to me about why the word pilgrimage is here as opposed to journey. A pilgrimage is almost has a sense of returning to some sacred place.
Yeah, it does. For me, it wasn't exactly a return. It was sort of like those pilgrims who go to Jerusalem or something. They can envision it, but they've never been there, maybe. And I think that I understood it was not just a meaningless slog. I think Alzheimer's often feels like a meaningless slog. You often can't tell exactly when it begins. You certainly don't know when it's going to end. It's not as if there's a timeline. So I was driving from the airport where I had come to take care of Mother one Thursday. It was actually for Friday morning. And I got lost in that spaghetti bowl of roads outside of Dallas, which is just, if you get lost, you have to get onto another highway and then another one and then another one, and panic sets in. And I realized that I was lost in more ways than one. I felt like I didn't know where I was going with this Alzheimer's thing. I didn't know how long it was going to last. I had 2 kids at home. I had a job. I was exhausted. And I stopped. All the lights had been turned off so that I couldn't stop anywhere to ask for the directions. So I saw a Wendy's that was open. It wasn't really open. They were just closing it down. And I drove off the road and went to talk to the guy. And it was a teenager who was closing up. And he gave me exact directions for how to get back to Mother. I wrote them down, and he was quite cheerful and wonderful. And I realized then, for some reason, these things happen in the middle of the night. You realize this is not just a meaningless slog. If I think about it, there are wonderful things that are coming to me because of this. It is really more like a pilgrimage. I am getting to know my mother better than I ever would have if I had not had to stay with her these last 10 years. And I'm getting to know my sister. And we're developing into a community. And besides that, I was learning certain kinds of what I think of as spiritual disciplines. Patience. Really a sense of humor. My mother was a very funny woman. So spending time with her was often quite funny. And other kinds of hospitality. I was learning things from this experience. And I guess it was the Greeks that said suffering brings knowledge. For me then, I think the rest of taking care of her, and there were still 4 years left or so, I thought of in terms of pilgrimage rather than just meaningless, repetitive activity.
You used the word spiritual before, so let me pursue this a little bit with you if you don't mind. many people have said during this process that there are certain spiritual moments that usually were unexpected that take place. Did you find that? Did you find some sense of spirituality in this process, especially in these last, as you were just alluding to, the last 4 or 5 years?
I did. A lot of it was rooted in the earth.
What do you mean?
Very cleaning clothes and cleaning apartments and just, taking care of people's physical needs. So I don't want to leave the impression that it was a very, ethereal spiritual journey. But here's an example of something that happened. Because Julie and I agreed with one another that we needed to live our lives, I was teaching students in London for a month, the month of January. And we happened to be in Paris because the students had a weekend off, and my husband and I went to Paris. And we were asleep. It was 2:00 in Paris, and my husband woke me up and said, "I think something's wrong with your mother." And I said, "Let me go back to sleep." And he said, "I'm calling Rich and Julie." He called them, and the first thing Rich said was, "Daniel, this is amazing. We just came from Mother's deathbed." And because we had been so connected with Mother, and particularly Daniel, I thought she visited him before she left. Right. One doesn't know how to explain these things. But I did have a very strong presence of her, feeling of presence, after she died. We went to Notre Dame Cathedral for a service because we were just lost. You're ready for it, but you're never
ready. When the call comes, you're never, I know that.
And so the day after was Sunday, and we went to Notre Dame Cathedral, and I thought, she's here. I feel that she's here. And I thought, and she doesn't like it one bit. She was a Baptist, and this is a Catholic cathedral. Moreover, she was a German, and these are French. And the sense of, wow, you do have those spiritual moments.
Yeah, I think a lot of, I think many people who walk this walk and who allow themselves to be open to experiencing or feeling things that they would not normally do, find themselves with variations on this story. I think you have to be open to it, and sometimes circumstances are created where something happens, you say, I never expected this, or something's happening. I think that's one of the more powerful aspects of this journey or this pilgrimage that you were on, and that others have also reported to me in some of the work. There's before we start running out of time, I want to pursue one thing. And this is a generalization. Society may look, or sometimes looks, at individuals dealing with Alzheimer's or dementia who are basically physical shells. Their mental, who they were as a cognitive individual has been taken away or has been lost, and there's a sense that, to use a very harsh word, but it appears in some of the literature, they're almost useless. They're there. Did you find that? Because I've also, and we're going to talk to somebody next week who's also had a similar experience. And she writes just the opposite. She says that's the totally horrible way to look at a human being. That you're shaking your head. Yes. So tell me what you found in especially these last couple of years.
I never experienced my mother as a shell.
Mm-hmm.
My way of thinking about Mother was that there were lots of different mothers inside of Mother, and that I was able to reconnect with those. Often when she would make comments that didn't make any sense, I connect those with stories she had told me.
Really?
From her past. She was never a shell. She was always subversive. She was always funny. She was always, So that's what I've tried to make you've got to treat these people not as patients or as shells, but as human beings. I think sometimes they become shells because they're treated like shells.
That's interesting. Yeah, and go ahead.
Well, you can make connections with them. And that was one of the blessings, I have to say, of my last decade with her. We had been formally, in some ways, alienated from one another. I left that fundamentalist religion. I became a reader. And during that last decade, we became close emotionally. So you can't do that with a shell.
Jeanne, I want that's if there's one message I think you want to leave and we want to take out of this conversation is just exactly what you're saying. People are human beings, no matter where they are in the stage of their life, and deserve that dignity and deserve that respect. The tragedy of so many people in this situation, in similar situations, that they are in facilities with no one there to comfort them and to speak with them and to hold them and to touch them and to kiss them sometimes and just to remind them that they're human beings.
Yeah.
Before we run out of time, I just want to briefly remind you that this portion of Boomer Generation Radio on WWDB has been brought to you by Kendal, a system of not-for-profit communities and services that advocates for and empowers older adults to reach their full potential. Together, we are transforming the experience of aging, and to learn more about Kendal, Kendal, we invite you again to visit kendal.org or call them toll-free at 888-759-0128. Jeanne Walker, the author of The Geography of Memory, A Pilgrimage Through Alzheimer's. Real fast, we have about 30 seconds. Somebody wants to get a hold of this book. Where do they get it?
You can order on Amazon. You can get it in many independent bookstores. I think some Barnes & Noble still have it. Mm-hmm. It's been out for a little bit. 6 months. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
good. We thank you. We thank you. Jeanne Walker, the author of The Geography of Memory, A Pilgrimage Through Alzheimer's. We want to thank you very much for coming on this conversation with Boomer Generation Radio. Continued good luck, especially good luck with teaching and everything. Thank you for sharing your experience. And again, a reminder, next week, we're going to be doing a whole hour just on this issue of Alzheimer's and dementia. Till next week, take care, everyone.